Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Welcome, Todd Green.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're very privileged today to have Dr. Todd Green with us. Just a little bit of an introduction to Dr. Green. So Dr. Green is an associate professor of religion at Luther College in Iowa, and he served in the faculty since 2008, and is also the interim director for Luther College's Center for Ethics and Public Engagement. Really importantly for today is this bit of background about Dr. Green. So his research primarily focuses on Islamophobia in the United States and Europe. And his first book on the topic, The Fear of Islam, An Introduction to Islamophobia in the West, was even cited in a court, US Supreme Court, as an amicus curiae, so something that's given that's not in a friendly way, but not a part of the court itself, as evidence. Dr. Green's also worked as an advisor on Islamophobia in Europe and at the US Department. So he's spoken on the topic to government audiences, including the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. And as you've seen in the introduction to this, there are lots of appearances on many media outlets, CNN, The Washington Post, and Al Jazeera. So the stream today specifically is around Dr. Green's book, Presumed Guilty: Why we shouldn't ask Muslims to condemn terrorism. And it's very interesting. We're going to sort of discuss the different aspects of the book, and it's very pertinent at the moment with what's happening in France. So I'm sure we'll get into this. So Dr. Green, first of all, welcome. We're very grateful you could join us, and we're honored to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
So I think we'll start off by Jordan, if you want to start that.
Yeah. So obviously, I echo Imran's. Having you on is a great privilege. Imran actually introduced me to your book a while ago, and it definitely shifted my mindset. And I can go into that a bit later. I think the first thing I wanted to ask you about your book, so let's talk about the title. So it's Presumed Guilty: Why we shouldn't ask Muslims to condemn terrorism. I think my first question would be, who is the we when you say why we shouldn't ask Muslims to condemn terrorism? Who is this book targeted to? I assume you probably want everybody to read. I certainly benefited from it. But who are the actual people that you're actually trying to get your message to?
No, it's a good question. It's not an all-inclusive we, and so you actually have to open the book past the front title to sort of understand why I use that language. But the audience is, well, on one hand, I want everyone to read the book, no matter what your religious background is. But I'm particularly trying to persuade white Europeans, white Americans, and white Christian European and Americans. That's the we I'm referring to, because I believe that's the portion of the population on both sides of the Atlantic that has the most difficulty understanding why it is problematic consistently and constantly and persistently to ask Muslims to condemn terrorism.
So, Professor Green, where do you think these sentiments are coming from? Why is there this expectation when obviously we don't see this required of other people? They're not automatically expected to condemn everyone that's white, for example, that does something, or Christian or Jewish or anything else. Where do you think this is coming from?
In the book, I address sort of three prongs to that question in terms of the response to it. One reason for this persistent questioning of Muslims and calling out Muslims in the aftermath of terrorist attacks is just a misunderstanding of what drives a lot of this kind of violence to begin with, Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever, right? It's this very simplistic, shallow assumption that Islam is the cause or Islam is the catalyst, and therefore all Muslims are somehow guilty or should be under suspicion for the violence in question, right? And we can talk more about this later, but I kind of try to unpack that and deconstruct that argument and the assumptions behind it. Another reason is simply that a lot of the majority populations of Europe and North America have little knowledge of what Muslims have been doing when it comes to condemning this to begin with. It's not difficult at all to find examples of Muslims condemning terrorism and extremist violence. A simple Google search engine, Muslims condemning terrorism, you will get plenty of hits, right? It doesn't take a someone with fancy Google skills at all. Just those 3 words will do it. But a lot of people in majority populations don't know this. And again, we can talk more about this later, but the question really is then why, given that the information is literally at their fingertips. And the final reason, to me, probably the most significant one, is the hardest one to address to the larger public in Europe and North America, particularly the majority populations, is that I believe this consistently putting Muslims on the spot, calling them out to condemn terrorism, and focusing the conversation on Muslims and violence, on Islam and violence, almost exclusively at times, is a way to divert attention from the very troubling history, the past and present, of white European, white American, and white Christian violence. And I'm not just talking about the Middle Ages. I'm talking about very modern history. I'm talking about the current world order that we live in today, and to what extent has so-called Western violence actually been very much integral to the creation and the maintenance of the global world order in which we find ourselves in. And that's a hard conversation to have, but I do think there's some evidence that this is a diversionary tactic.
Yeah, I think I like what you said there in terms of, and obviously this links directly to your question, doesn't it? Because I think when I picked up your book, I thought it's a really interesting title. Why shouldn't we ask Muslims to condemn terrorism? I guess the 3 reasons you've given are reasons almost why you shouldn't, right? I think you kind of suggested that the question assumes that Islam has some kind of responsibility. The question ignores the fact that Muslims do in fact call terrorism out, and your book outlines many prominent Muslim organizations that constantly call it out, but for whatever reason we don't really hear about that much, and there's this kind of assumption that Muslims are very quiet about this. And the third point you just mentioned, which I think, like you said, we can get into it later, but it's a bit that really interests me as a white man just like yourself. And I think back to, and I don't know, maybe you had a previous mindset before you got into all this as well, is this distraction from having, maybe us having to call out atrocities and out from our backgrounds. Why am I not linked to, I don't know, KKK lynchings in the past? And your book goes through various things. Whereas as a Muslim, because I'm looking at both angles. I'm a white person who doesn't have to answer for any white stuff. But I'm also a Muslim that constantly get asked, do you condemn ISIS? You're a Muslim. And so there's a clear double standard. And I thought that part of your book was fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think the other thing I wanted to actually say was, you've mentioned that there's this misunderstanding amongst the average person. Do you think that's a consequence of just some organic issue that's perhaps laziness, or is this a wider problem where this has been perhaps orchestrated by people of power and money to sort of have this smoke screen out there where people are convinced? I mean, I remember reading your book and going through it twice, and you mentioned very early on this episode where you're in South Carolina. I think it was Spartanburg. You're having dinner after a talk, and I suppose it said average American couple having dinner next to you, and this sort of middle-aged old lady, she sort of like, almost you could argue, sort of mildly assaults you. Could you sort of give us an idea of where this issues are coming from, and that particular incident in itself I found quite shocking, really.
Me too. No, yeah. And the short version of that incident was I had given a talk at a local college in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And we have to keep in mind the context. This is the early spring of 2016, I believe. So this is election year. This is, and South Carolina is Trump country. So I probably should have known better than not to speak too loudly in a public place where I was talking about Islamophobia. And we were talking about all sorts of things that probably weren't conducive to the larger environment that we were in. But we were at a public restaurant and talking to colleagues from this college where they had invited me to speak. And Islamophobia was certainly one of the main topics, since that's why they invited me there and at dinner. And but yeah, an elderly couple from a neighboring table didn't like what they heard. And as they were leaving the restaurant to protest what they had to hear, the wife came over and grabbed onto my shoulder and told me to shut up. And she was red and livid, and all of our jaws were sort of just dropped to the floor, right? And then her husband really had to grab her and kind of pull her away from me. And no, I didn't press charges or anything, but it was a reminder of the climate, political climate, cultural climate, how things have gotten much worse actually. And since, say, for example, 9/11, which is sometimes a surprise to audiences I try to engage with, they even those who are anti-Islamophobia sort of want to believe that, well, we'll just progress and get better naturally, right? And I'm not a big believer at all that we just naturally progress. We have to work at it. We have to organize. We have to make efforts here. And what's going on here is a political environment in which, yes, a lot of Islamophobia is orchestrated. This tie between this effort to make an organic link between Islam and violence is very much orchestrated by political actors, oftentimes on one end of the political spectrum, but not exclusively. There are other political actors across the political spectrum, and this is true in Britain, it's true in other parts of Europe, it's true in the United States, who maybe more inadvertently or more implicitly feed these arguments as well. It's not just, in other words, political conservatives who are asking Muslims to condemn terrorism. It's Barack Obama, it's Pope Francis, it's you can just go on and on, right? There's a larger political environment in which this sort of anxiety about Muslims has been stoked, and a lot of people have invested in it across the political spectrum, which makes the work of trying to combat it, to respond to these narratives, and to try to penetrate the Islamophobia that shrouds the entire thing, right? Much more difficult.
So that's fascinating, actually, because you paint a picture of almost a ubiquitous spreading of this idea of the link between Islam and terrorism, irrespective of your sort of political allegiances. So I think the thought that came to me, because actually quite a long time ago, I came across an instance where somebody on a BBC news program was being asked to condemn an event that had happened. I can't remember the event now. And he actually steadfastly refused. And it shocked me at the time, because at that time I was also in this mindset of, look, the first thing you say is, I condemn this, and then you move on to your next thing. And I didn't think any deeper into it until that incident, when I saw that interview. And that's actually what prompted me to search out the book. I did a little bit of research, and I saw this, and I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I read that. And from that point, it completely changed my approach to this. And it's been difficult because as Jordan has mentioned, as Abbas has mentioned, that most Muslim, and even I was in that camp where I'm you're almost apologetic about everything that is associated with Islam because of the way it's transmitted in the West. And I think the question that I was thinking about again after rereading your book, sort of in preparation for this, was for you as a Christian, as somebody who teaches at the Luther College, as a white man. What prompted you? What brought about your research into this? Where was the things that sort of made you think, actually, this is something that's interesting that I need to get into? Was it an experience, or was it actually a mindset, or was it some ethical basis for your research starting?
Well, the bigger picture here, of course, is how did I get interested in the research in Islamophobia, period? And then there's a specific question of this book, Presumed Guilty, right? Yeah. The larger question would take a much longer time to address, but a short version of that would be that I grew up in the United States in the Deep South, which is an area of the United States which is dominated by white evangelical Christians. But I didn't grow up resonating with white evangelical Christianity. It's not a language that spoke to me. It was not a way of looking at the world or a God that spoke to me. And I grew up sort of having a lot of anxiety about my own religious identity and what that was. And all I knew as a teenager, at least, was whatever I am, I'm not that, right? So this idea of growing up in a context in which you are trying to talk about religion and negotiate your religious identity with a larger majority that you think might be a little bit hostile to you, or, real or perceived hostility, right? That's something that has stuck with me as an adult. And when I became a religious historian and scholar, I naturally gravitated towards people who find themselves in the minority. And in this case, not just Muslims. Muslims became more my primary focus, but in the history of the United States or Europe, we think about Jews and Muslims and basically anyone who's not Christian. And in some context, anyone who's not Protestant, or maybe other European contexts, than say Southern Europe, those who are not Catholic, but anyone who finds themselves in the religious minority and the challenges they face, right? Another experience I had, in the mid 1990s was I immigrated to Europe for a little while. I met someone who I started dating, and long story short, I followed her back. She was from Sweden, and I got my immigrant papers, and I lived and worked in Sweden for a while in the mid 90s. But my fellow immigrants in Sweden at that time, as you guys can probably guess, were not other Southerners from the United States, right? They were mostly Muslims from Muslim majority regions, the former Yugoslavia, amongst other places, some from Somalia and Turkey. So I felt a connection even back then to, even though some of our experiences with immigration in Sweden and in Europe were obviously different, but I felt a connection as well. So that drove me into this area. But in terms of this particular book, I think I'd already kind of delved pretty deeply by the time I wrote this book into the study of Islamophobia. But as someone who did a lot of public speaking, a lot of media engagements, other kinds of consultations, I kept encountering these kinds of questions from audiences. Well, why don't Muslims condemn terrorism? I've never heard a Muslim condemn terrorism. And of course, I have many Muslim friends who were constantly being inundated with that question. And with the rise of ISIS, that question only became much more persistent as that violence was broadcast on various media outlets so widely. And the question itself, it wasn't just that it rubbed me the wrong way. I find the question itself deeply racist. But you don't easily just pop out that word when you're engaging people who are asking a question that they feel like is just an innocent question. So I wanted to develop some kind of fairly short resource, and this book is not too long, that helps broader audiences sort of get to the core of why the question itself is problematic, why it's not an innocent question, and maybe to think a little bit more about why Muslims are asked such a question. And yet when Anders Breivik in Norway engages in a mass murder spree, or the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, or Dylan Roof, who opened fire in an African-American church in South Carolina in 2015, Todd Green is not pulled out in front of the public and asked to condemn this violence. Most people just assume I condemn this violence unless I were to say something otherwise, right? I'm afforded individuality. I am afforded the benefit of the doubt in a way that Muslims are not. And the only way that really works on the side of asking Muslims to condemn terrorism is to start to recognize there's a form of racism at work here in which all Muslims are presumed guilty for the actions of one or a few. There's something that links all Muslims together, or people who have a Muslim background together, in the way that white Americans, white Europeans, white Christians particularly, were not linked in that same way. And that's a double standard. That's the nicest way to put it. It's a double standard, but it's also, I felt it was time to push deeper into this, to sort of give people resources to think a lot more critically about this, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, because this is a question posed to Muslims that comes from across the journalistic spectrum and across the political spectrum. It's not just the equivalent of the Fox News in the United States, or it's the New York Times. The New York Times has plenty of columnists who ask these questions. This is considered a left-leaning publication, right? And its equivalents in Europe. So that's why I wrote this particular book.
Yeah, I go on, Abbas. I got lots of questions, but I think you ask.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you've said that people obviously use this Islamophobia in politics, for example. But, you mentioned, for example, studies by Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago, Professor Scott Atran. There's a lot of data, hard evidence out there, actually, which agrees with your view and obviously our view, and not the view of the people who say that this is somehow an Islamic problem rather than a geopolitical one. I can understand the political, environment where they will use Islamophobia to get votes. But why do you think that they're not being challenged in the media, for example, the mainstream media and even social media? This myth is just perpetuated. Why are so many people complicit effectively in reinforcing this lie?
There are two reasons that come to mind. One of them is that you have so many public figures and people from other sorts of institutions, not just political ones, media, for example, that really aren't well educated in the study of religion, or the study of religion and violence, religion and politics. which is actually a very complicated topic, right? But when you put journalists out there who have very little working knowledge of this, and who are oftentimes overworked, they're working at a frantic pace to keep up with the media cycle, and they don't have time to do more in-depth research, much less shore up the weaknesses they may have in their own background academically. Then these sort of shallow explanations resonate, and they're easier to reproduce, right, as opposed to question them. The other more disturbing way to respond to this is that we have to take seriously the possibility that there are a lot of segments of society in Europe and in North America that are more broadly invested in a certain geopolitical order and the benefits that might come from that geopolitical order and that global hierarchy, then we're oftentimes willing to admit. It's not just, again, and say, take the United States, for example, hardcore political conservatives that want to have U.S. military dominance globally, right, or U.S. military hegemony or political or economic hegemony in the Middle East. That's pretty broadly something that's accepted and encouraged, even if sometimes if only tacitly or implicitly, by the political left and by many in the media. The easiest reminder of this is the so-called war on terror, and who was actually kind of invested in that early on. Well, in the United States and some of our allies in Europe and elsewhere, there was pretty broad political support for that, right? It wasn't just one wing of the political spectrum. So we have to interrogate that a bit more too. And once we do that, then other more disturbing questions are going to arise. But who benefits from the current geopolitical order? Who's invested in it? And which institutions help to perpetuate certain kinds of Islamophobic narratives, even if implicitly and maybe sometimes unconsciously, in order to bolster a certain kind of West versus the rest, or U.S. and Western superiority, clash of civilizations sort of narratives that you find out there, and that's another reason why, I think.
Not sure enough. I think for me, so if going back to your first point about this question, why we shouldn't ask Muslims to condemn terrorism, kind of assumes that Islam is responsible. What I really liked in your book, as a Muslim, I would, if someone was to ask me about it, I would use examples of our Prophet, peace be upon him. I would use sort of teachings and stuff to try and tell people that there's no way this ISIS can be linked to what I follow, what I've embraced. But what I love about your book is that you go into, you bring a lot of facts. One thing that sticks out was an ISIS member being found with Islam for Dummies, and you bring these kind of, and I think there's many stats in there. Right? If I think about maybe 3 out of 4 people actually know someone within ISIS already. You mentioned many sociological problems, or maybe even political, as opposed to the religion itself. And you, rather than backing up with, as I might do as a Muslim, you actually back it up with some really interesting ways to point out these aren't your average practicing Muslims. These aren't necessarily people even following Islam as maybe you'd think. They are people with very little knowledge, and they are, like you rightly say, it's not the cause. The religion isn't the cause, but it is the justification that they get once they've already got the cause. And I think your book rides home really nicely with that.
Right. It's again, it's one of the things that would be helpful if more people in the public and in both sides of the Atlantic had better education in just the study of religion, period. Religion rarely, religion, in my opinion, as a historian, never operates sort of in isolation from very particular social and political circumstances and context, right? And that's equally true for people who get recruited for ISIS as it is for white supremacists in the United States. There's something else going on there that you have to pay attention to, and that's oftentimes what's lost here. So yeah, for someone like me, it's not a surprise when you look at the data and you see something I had already suspected, which is these are probably guys going to join ISIS who know next to nothing about Islam or have a very marginal connection at best. Maybe they have a Muslim background in terms of family or whatnot, but they're not practicing Muslims in many cases. Or they have very little knowledge, actually, of Islamic texts or traditions or histories or rituals. And yeah, as I note in the book, over and over again, MI5 behavioral unit, Oxford University, You have various other scholarly studies on this, and other anecdotal evidence I sort of provide that just over and over again reinforces this idea that many of the people who get recruited there don't know much about Islam. What I believe they are looking for oftentimes is a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, and maybe they are lacking that in the country that they currently live in, whether that's Britain or the United States or Canada or anywhere else, right? They're alienated. And here comes ISIS, and whatever the horrors are of ISIS, they were quite effective at reaching out to disaffected, alienated young men, particularly, and say, "Well, we will give you a home. We'll give you a brotherhood. We'll give you a sense of meaning and purpose." Right? And no need for Islamic literacy required. Right? Hence, you have the two men from Birmingham, England, in I think 2013, 2014, who decide to go to Syria, not to join ISIS yet, but to join another terrorist organization. And, they have to get on Amazon and buy, the Quran for Dummies and, Islam for Dummies. And, you have journalists, if you read stories from back then, including the British press, you have journalists sort of scratching their heads trying to figure out why would they order books like that? And then for those of us who study this, it's because that's the kind of people ISIS recruits. In fact, if these two guys had actually known more about Islam, it's very unlikely they would have tried to go to Syria to begin with, much less ordered these two books. They would have had a much better knowledge base. But it makes sense. They've already found their cause. They've found their purpose. Now they're going to read to sort of figure out, okay, now what is it I'm supposed to be fighting for again? No, but they've already decided they're going to fight for something, right? They've been given this larger purpose, and that's what we find over and over again with a lot of these recruits. So it's not like a question of whether Islam is or isn't a part of the equation. It's more a question of how do terrorist organizations in their recruitment, how do they instrumentalize and try to sanctify a cause by reference to Islam, by reference to grievances that Muslims might have, in order to draw recruits, right? And that's a very different question than what text is there in the Quran that's making them go do that. That's the kind of approach I've seen with a number of governments. The French government is a classic example of this, where you had many French politicians not long ago, a couple of years ago, who suggested that the Quran needs to be edited, right? Needs to be redacted to take out some problematic passages. And that's just reflecting this very simplistic mindset that someone opens the Quran, they read a passage, they close it, and they go off and they do something horrific, right? That's just not how religion works. It's not how Islam works.
So I think that's really fascinating that one of the the thing that you mentioned, and you mentioned this in your book as well, that actually knowledge of Islam, if it's in depth, is probably a protective factor against becoming somebody who becomes recruited by ISIS. And I think that when in my discussions with young Muslims who are also feeling the pain of other Muslims around the world suffering in whatever conflict happens to be going on, often one of the things we talk about is actually the teachings of Islam. We tend to go into the general principle that the ends never justify the means according to our Islamic tradition. So you can't do something bad even if you think you're trying to do and achieve a good outcome. But often there is this sort of presentation that the real Muslims who are actually following the religion correctly are these terrorists or these people who are doing these atrocities. And actually all the other Muslims are just watered down versions of Islam because they happen to be living in the West. And that's quite a pervasive narrative. I think I've come across that pretty much everywhere where I've tried to have this discussion with non-Muslims. And I can see that this is probably a fear that a lot of people hold, even if they don't hold it in a pejorative way. They sort of feel that, are you actually, are you just a soft Muslim, or are you want? And this term moderate and is thrown around as well. And I don't like these categories personally. What are your thoughts on how is that an accurate thing, and how would we go about combating that the understanding that we see amongst many people?
No, I think it is, even if it's not called attention to explicitly. There is that assumption, right? That means that's part of the presumption of guilt, the guilt by association. That whatever members of ISIS or sympathizers of ISIS are doing, no matter what horrible deeds they do. Let's take the November 2015 Paris attacks, right? Mm-hmm. That it must be Muslims, broadly speaking, that are sympathetic to this and that have harbored terrorists in their midst or have been teaching something that breeds such people, right? And ideologically breeds them. And therefore, everyone should be presumed guilty, right? This is we can go on and on today about the kinds of pervasive policies in Europe and in the United States that target Muslims for surveillance and profiling and counterterrorism and all sorts of things. That, you know, even a growing movement in Europe to restrict freedom of religion for Muslims. That all operates under a collective guilt by association mentality. Therefore, you know, all Muslims have some responsibility for this, right? And therefore, this must be something that is particularly Islamic. The most infamous example, one I still rail against to this day, and I do mention it in the book, is a very prominent journalist here in the United States, a man named Graham Wood, who wrote a very widely read piece in the Atlantic back in 2015 called, well, you know, What ISIS Wants. Well, what ISIS Really Wants, I think, is the name of the title. And he very provocatively and controversially argues in there that ISIS is Islamic, very Islamic. And I think that's an exact quote from him, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm here thinking, reading this journalist, I'm thinking, you know, who is he to determine what is and isn't Islamic, right? As a religion scholar, I pay attention to how people who practice their own religion determine what's Islamic or not Islamic, Christian or not Christian, Jewish or not Jewish, right? As opposed to I have some sort of objective standard here setting by my side, and I can take an action that someone who's a Muslim does and then compare it to what I have over here. But, you know, journalists, in my opinion, shouldn't be in that business at all. Now, he could certainly interview members of ISIS and then write a story on how they try to justify what they're doing as Islamic, right? That's a different thing than he authoritatively saying this is Islamic, very Islamic. But it was, you know, something that resonated very broadly in the media. And I think it was one of the most widely circulated online articles that the Atlantic ever published. That tells you something, right? I mean, it was also at a time when people were kind of desperate for learning more about ISIS, and it was an easy explanation. Let's not really get into the complexity of the political circumstances, how the U.S. invasion of Iraq actually, you know, paved the way for the birth of ISIS or anything like that. Let's just look to Islam, you know, and this is all about Islam, and of course it just negates the reality that over 1 billion Muslims want to have nothing to do with this, and to see this as completely un-Islamic, right? But that's not a ready-made story that's easy to digest for the broader public, the reading public, particularly the majority populations in the United States and North America and in Europe. So it gets put out there and gets widely circulated, and he remains a highly respected journalist, right? And then people like me, little academics, write our little books, and we will critique it, right? But I would probably argue that my critique of Wood and all the problems with sort of reinforcing this narrative that ISIS and terrorism is basically about Islam, that people like me are still sort of the exception, trying, you know, beyond Muslims themselves, of course, but are the exception in terms of trying to penetrate that narrative. It's that broadly embraced and accepted.
So one of the things that is fascinating is I remember actually when that article came out in the Atlantic, Mehdi Hassan and I think this Graham Wood had a bit of an interaction on the interview. Very interesting to watch for those who haven't watched it. So I think when it comes to, and you said something very, very profound, and it's also echoed in your book as well, about the idea that if a small number of people can represent Islam, why can't we flip that and say the larger number of people also represent Islam? And that being that the vast majority of Muslims that don't want anything to do with this sort of terrorist attacks that happen, and why are they not held up as representatives? Whereas we'll take the minority and we will hold them up as representative. But then one of the things that I often have mentioned in discussions is this concept of generalizing the negative about a people and then specifying the positive. So if someone is doing something good who happens to be a Muslim, the religion is sort of not really considered part of that goodness. But if someone does something bad, then this is sort of automatically this is the religion that's behind all of this. So this is something that we see quite often, and I think you can see this in other, you know, if you look at any other social ills that are affecting society. So we see this in sort of maybe racially profiling Black people or Hispanics or whoever that minority happens to be, is that we'll look at their actions and then think of if they're negative as representative group. Whereas if their actions are positive, it's sort of just taken to be maybe an individualistic good as opposed to being something that you can. Whereas that you wouldn't be held accountable for anyone who's either Christian or white, even if you do something negative. And so that's I think you have got some really fascinating insights that that I came across.
Yeah, and the piece I would like to pick up there briefly is just in the study of Islamophobia, scholars oftentimes talk about the good Muslim, bad Muslim binary, right? And who are good Muslims, or who are the moderate Muslims, which are oftentimes equated as the good Muslims. And, you know, I even skirt dangerously close to crossing a line in the book, right? When I start to talk about that Muslims have been, you have Muslims who are members of the Metropolitan Police in London and NYPD in New York City, and Muslims who served in the British military and died in the Iraq War, and the U.S. military as well. And these oftentimes come across as, you know, good Muslims, right? And what does a Muslim have to do in Britain? What does a Muslim have to do in the United States in order to be deemed good and separated from the otherwise perceived collective that's bad? Well, oftentimes they have to put on some kind of uniform, preferably put themselves in harm's way in the battle against terrorism. And if they happen to go onto the battlefield and die in the process and come home in a body bag or whatever, right, then all of a sudden they've been finally accepted. That's an awfully high cost and high bar to pass, right? That I don't have to do, right? You know, my belonging in the United States, for example, is not predicated on whether I go join the military and go fight a war in Iraq or Afghanistan or fight ISIS or anything like that. You know, my belonging is just taken for granted. So I don't have those same standards. So the pressure that Muslims understandably face to sort of pass some kind of test or overcome some kind of obstacle in terms of belonging oftentimes involves pressures to be a good Muslim that are set by, broadly speaking, the majority population, but oftentimes political actors who don't really have Muslims' best interests at heart to begin with, and they're not necessarily dedicated to full civil liberties for Muslims or in full inclusion in the British society or American society. And this is part of the real challenge of combating Islamophobia, is that playing by the rules that are oftentimes set by an Islamophobic discourse and an Islamophobic political order, Muslims have ridiculously high standards, if not impossible standards. You know, the Muslims that are actually celebrated oftentimes are the Muslims who die in fighting in some kind of cause in terms of the war on terror, or in the case of Ahmed Berabeh, the French police officer in the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015, right? Who without a doubt, courageous, brave, gets the French Legion of Honor, and you know, why is he so celebrated, right? Because he died. He's a Muslim who's willing to die, right? Yeah. And in a very narrow sense, you can appreciate someone who's willing to sacrifice their life for the protection of others. But for Muslims, it's not just that, right? It is. We will trust that you are committed to France, committed to Britain, committed to America, if and only if you pay that ultimate price. But by the way, you won't be around then afterwards to actually enjoy the benefits of that. And if you don't do this, then, and if you don't put on the military uniform and the police uniform, then you're still going to be suspect, right? You're still going to be treated as part of the collective. And pushing back on Islamophobia when that's the script that Muslims are pressured to follow is extraordinarily difficult.
So, Todd, one of the things I wanted to ask you is just sort of perhaps take you back a little bit in terms of the causes. You know, you mentioned like the media, for example, that it's fairly easy to do a bit of homework and realize that actually your opinions about Islam and Muslims are actually quite wrong. Now, I mean, for me as a Muslim, I see that quite, as you were saying, a very easy thing to do. But the very fact that they don't want to do it, perhaps I'm being a little bit pessimistic, but I feel that this is not something just out of laziness, but more really having a predisposition already quite firm in place, and just a confirmation bias of wanting to find things to reinforce those biases. So what I'm saying is that there doesn't even seem to be this desire to actually find out the truth. And furthermore, as Muslims, I suppose what's frustrating is that if I were to, and quite rightly so, if I were to be going out and funding terrorism, disunity, propagating violence or whatever, I'd be arrested, and that's obviously how it should be. But then you've got the likes of Steve Bannon, who'll come into Europe, meet our prime minister before he was elected. He'll meet Le Pen, he'll meet Wilders in Holland. He'll do the rounds, and he's got huge amounts of money backing. and you think to yourself, well, this guy clearly is up to no good. Everybody knows what he's doing. He's pushing that very far right agenda, and he's known to be a white supremacist. He's known to be an Islamophobe. But it just appears that these people can get away with this type of thing, and everybody else is scrutinized to the extent whereby, you know, if I accidentally donate to the wrong charity, I could be sort of questioned as to what the hell am I doing, you know? So it just seems like it's a much more sinister web of deceit that's going on, that's being funded by a lot of very powerful people. And they're really sort of pulling these strings, and the puppets, the puppeteer at the back are the ones with all the money, and the puppets like our prime minister or the prime minister in France or the media are just the ones that they're pulling the strings of. Is that how you see it as well? Because I think that's how a lot of Muslims perhaps see it.
No, there is a veritable industry, right, of anti-Muslim organizations and actors on both sides of the Atlantic who make a living, have a career, a livelihood that is dependent solely on generating Islamophobic narratives and tapping into and stirring up fears and anxieties and hostilities among the majority population. And they often have financial motivations to do this. They have political motivations to do this. Oftentimes, at least for example in the United States, these organizations have very strong views on the U.S.'s foreign policy when it comes to Israel, right, and Palestine and Palestinian rights and that sort of thing. And then a lot of their investment in that is to further a political cause, in addition to their, fill the coffers, that they get from donors, right? And this is pretty persistent. The thing is, and I would say this is true on both sides of the Atlantic, that 13 years ago or so, these were still largely fringe players. But they haven't been waning, right? They haven't been sort of receding from political life and public life. They've actually gained influence. And in doing so, I would say even that they have started to strengthen ties across the Atlantic. So Geert Wilders' career is dependent upon, part upon, help and support he gets from other actors in the Netherlands and in Europe. It's also dependent in part upon the Robert Spencers and the Pamela Gellers and Frank Gaffneys of the United States, right? And their power has been growing. And I'm not saying anything that's not pretty widely known at this point in the study of Islamophobia, but the Trump administration has been surrounded by people who have deep ties to the Islamophobia industry, and these networks. So that's definitely a part of it. And the other sinister part, maybe, is that the media oftentimes has been very complicit in promoting these narratives and circulating them, even if they are ostensibly questioning them. But when you give these narratives a platform, when you bring these people on to CNN or BBC or whatever, you are in some ways validating that they have a plausible perspective that needs to be considered, and that a larger public needs to be exposed to. Those aren't objective, neutral decisions, and those are decisions that are moral decisions too, that we must start to question. And the final thing I'll say in terms of the media part, at least, is that we have to recognize that many media outlets themselves, as I said earlier, are invested in some of the larger narratives about Western hegemony, but they are also, it depends on the media outlet, of course, and where we're talking about, but they're also oftentimes driven by viewers and the need to have viewers and people visit their websites and watch. And in the United States, for example, the overwhelming majority of media outlets are owned by one of 6 or 7 corporations, right? The corporate media is all about ratings and money, and the idea is not necessarily to challenge in significant ways the biases of a broader public, but to reinforce them. There is not a lot of incentive to challenge these biases. I will say I meet individual journalists, I have met individual journalists who are willing to push back on that, but when they're still embedded in a larger system, right, that benefits from Islamophobic narratives, we have our work cut out for us. I love the fact that we have Mehdi Hasan, right? And we need, thousands of people like him, but, we have a handful and again, on both sides of the Atlantic that have prominent media platforms. And it's going to take longer to sort of, from within these media organizations to sort of penetrate that. And in the meantime, I always encourage people to look to alternative media outlets, those that aren't driven by corporate interest, and that provide more nuanced understandings and coverage on stories that pertain to Muslims, and that's not stuff that you get in most of the major media outlets, whether that be the BBC or the Times or the New York Times here or the CNN. There are many that have done a great job over the years, and I long for the day when that will change. But the media has too much invested in this as well.
So, Todd, one of the things is that, you've mentioned the political elite, the political system. To some extent, it's being fed by the propaganda against Islam. So you're turning a public effectively to be very negative about Islam, and therefore to win votes. It's a sort of a very sort of a spiral of hatred, whereby you now have to have that narrative if you want the vote. So it sort of just feeds off one another, But I can understand that to some extent, but for Muslims, for example, we would expect law enforcement, in particular, our secret services, people who are involved in countering violent extremism and what have you, like the MI5 or the FBI or whatever. What I find very concerning, though, is that understanding the political reasons, understanding the media and why they might do it, but then you sort of find that our law enforcement that's out there to protect us, hopefully us all, often do such dubious things like planting people into mosques or amongst Muslims, almost encouraging them, and not in fact almost, but actually encouraging them to commit acts of terrorism, to start planning these acts and what have you, just so they can sort of go out later and arrest them. I mean, why would our intelligence services be doing things like that?
I think in part because intelligence services in Western countries, again, are still tied to government policies and government narratives, right? That's part of their business, is to shore up the larger narratives that they encounter. It's the business that they're in. So when you have the use of informants, when you have, what we would call in the United States entrapment, and other schemes that are developed by law intelligence services, law enforcement agencies, to sort of try to create terrorist plots that don't exist, and then attach Muslims to them, and then spring the plot, and you're like, aha, I got you, right? You're basically catching terrorists that weren't really terrorists, right? But you've made them into this in order to sort of signal that you are, again, having success in the larger war on terror against terrorism, right? Which is a political winner for political elites, right? But this is the raison d'etre, right, of many intelligence agencies, particularly in the post 9/11 world, particularly during the war on terror. And I do think, broadly speaking, that many intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies have absorbed this narrative of Muslims as the existential threat and enemy, right? This is the major turn in Western nations after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. Who remains the most significant threat when it comes to Western military and political hegemony, and it's certain Muslim populations abroad, right? But then after 9/11, the Muslim enemy abroad in the war on terror gives reason for intelligence agencies to look at Muslims at home as a symbolic stand-in for the enemy abroad. That's not an uncommon feature in history. We see that over and over again. When you are engaged in military action or in war, you find people from within who become scapegoats for the perceived enemy that you have abroad. In the United States, the example I always give is during the Second World War, the internment of Japanese Americans, under the Roosevelt administration. Why did the Roosevelt administration basically intern Japanese Americans at all? Because they were guilty of anything? They were only guilty of having the quote-unquote wrong ancestry, right? In a time of war in which Japan is one of the main enemies. So they become symbolic stand-ins, representations of the enemy abroad. And in the incessant war on terror and counterterrorism efforts and all of that, as long as you are involved in an aggressive military action abroad, whether that's Britain or the United States, the Muslims at home will continue to be the symbolic stand-ins in all these counterterrorism policies and efforts at, using informants, entrapment, all of that will be aimed at Muslims, not to mention the infamous Prevent program of Britain that that basically encourages social workers and teachers and others to turn on Muslims and to turn them in, right, or to be suspicious of them. But that's all under the guise and the context of this broader conflict, globally speaking, right, that Muslims now in Britain are the symbolic stand-ins for, which is one of the reasons I argue, not that this makes the argument against Islamophobia easier to achieve, right, but if you want to see that significant decline in the targeting of Muslim populations domestically when it comes to law enforcement or intelligence agencies, we have to see a real end to military invasions and military and interventions in Muslim majority countries abroad. But that's a harder sell, right? Even though we've certainly declined in some of those military engagements, but it's still ongoing. As long as there's a war abroad, there's going to be the targeting of Muslim populations at home. They're connected.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of, because I think for Muslims, for me to talk about foreign policy to people as an explanation of why these events might be happening within Western countries, it's very hard to not get construed as a justification. And I think as a Muslim, I know that I would often self-censor when it comes to having these types of discussions with people, and maybe wrongly so, I think. But actually, often a mention of foreign policy in any discussion about a terrorist attack is always taken as some sort of justification being made, even if you go to the sort of lengths of explaining, actually, I'm not justifying, I'm trying to maybe understand the reasons why so that we can prevent these things from happening. It's never taken in that way. And I think just, on the point of the society being turned against Muslims to a certain extent. I work as a doctor, as a physician, and one of the things that came in the UK was with the prevent strategy, was it actually that even teachers and doctors and people who are sort of dealing with children or vulnerable people, whether it's health-wise or mental health-wise, on a daily basis, were asked to sort of keep an eye out for what a terrorist who may be susceptible to becoming radicalized or a terrorist. Now, the first question I asked in one of these meetings we were being trained was, what are the signs? And then what are the evidence that these signs lead to these sorts of actions happening? And really there wasn't really, and almost the person seemed almost sort of downbeaten because there wasn't really a thing. If somebody books a holiday to go to Pakistan, I should be more alert. It was really bizarre, the sort of things that were being put forward. Or if a young Muslim boy happens to be going through a period of depression, I should be thinking about whether or not this person can become radicalized. And it's sort of, as someone who's sort of in the profession where you try to care about people's physical health and even mental health, it felt like I was being made to sort of become adversarial towards the people I'm supposed to be actually having some sort of duty of care towards. So this, I completely hear what you say about the whole society being sort of incorporated into this sort of effort. So I think one of the things that I often would like to, I would like to ask you actually is, and I often think about, is that these groups that are set up within, or these organizations that are set up within governments to try and prevent these terrorist acts from happening. And I know that you've worked in sort of these environments and you've sort of advised many of these groups to sort of improve policy, but it seems to me they've got it backwards. They don't really understand the process, maybe because there isn't a clear process. What are your thoughts on that? How can we improve the government's understanding and improve their policy making on these sorts of matters?
Yeah, my experience for a year in the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C., I'm grateful for the experience. I did not leave there being more optimistic about our chances to shape government policy in the short run, at least. Long run is another story. But I don't see significant change taking place, whether it's policies in terms of terrorism or whatnot, right, or other things, until there's a real desire to relinquish the primary foreign policy narrative that has dominated many Western nations since the end of the Second World War, right? With decolonization in terms of former European empires, including the British, the rise of the United States and the Cold War battle with the Soviet Union and Europe trying to sort of find its place in this new world order. There's still this heavy investment in a certain kind of, again, of a global political order, and who should benefit from that politically and economically, and who should not. And that then ends up dictating certain kinds of domestic policies as well, as we were talking about earlier. And so I think you need politicians, you need elections that will change the political elites in these various countries so that you have more people who are willing to really rethink that, right? And that sounds like a massive change that has to take place. And I wish I had a better, softer way of saying, it's not going to be that hard, but it's going to be very difficult. In the United States, I'll give you an example. In the Democratic primaries for the Democratic Party, the two candidates that came closest to being willing to question and rethink U.S. militarism were probably Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, right? And they did fairly well, but they didn't win. And we were still not quite at a place in the United States where a candidate like that can pull it off. They were also amongst the only two candidates that were really willing to ask some critical questions about U.S. foreign policy in relation to Israel. And pushing more for a narrative of Palestinian rights, which is not still something that's widely accepted in the Democratic Party. Remember, the Democratic Party are the liberals, but there's these policies are so ingrained and across the political spectrum, and there are just so many people invested in it. It will take a different kind of political order, really, in order for a lot of this stuff to change. And I don't know of another way for that to happen aside from grassroots political movements on both sides of the Atlantic that really puts the pressure from below. I've just given up, and I don't mean this to be cynical, but I've sort of given up on thinking, well, I'm just going to wait around until Britain has the right prime minister, until the United States gets the right president or the right congressional leaders, and then this is all going to change. I think the change has to be demanded from the broader electorate, and I hope in my lifetime I see more of that, but I've seen some movement in the United States, for example, to be sure, but we've got a long way to go. And in the meantime, the best we can really do is, try to hold these nations accountable to the laws, in theory, that the civil rights that they claim to stand by, the freedoms that they claim to maintain for their citizens, that we have to hold them accountable when they cross the line. Which is what I think many anti-Islamophobia activists are trying to do, to be sure. But there's just too many politicians invested in really toxic policies, and they have been for a long time, that make that kind of change very difficult, at least from above. I often talk about we have to change from below.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. I think I've got, I guess, a question off the back of all of that. One thing that just intrigued me personally is obviously a big respect for you saying all this, and obviously you're talking about government. You're going very deep and sort of almost being critical. And I've noticed that if you dare agree with the Muslims on various topics, you may become very unpopular. So I'm just wondering how many friends you've lost, or your experience. Obviously in much respect for your work. I'm just wondering what has have the costs been for you? If you can answer that, I don't know. That's a fair question.
No, it is a fair question. I don't get it asked very often, so I actually appreciate your willingness to go there, because on one hand, I don't want to sort of present myself as someone who's persecuted, right, or oppressed, or anything along those lines. I certainly have all sorts of privilege being who I am in terms of my background, my perceived background, and my platform as a professor. But yeah, you do this work publicly, which I do. You put yourself in the crossfires of some people who have a lot of power and a lot of money to make your life potentially miserable. I've had to bump heads with the likes of Robert Spencer or Pamela Geller, and these are people who have resources I don't have. I don't have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars at my disposal in terms of connecting with other organizations in order to generate the kind of narratives I do. I don't have the kind of protections they have in that regard. I don't have influence in the White House that they have and other political corridors of power. And when they come after you, it depends on when they do it and how they do it, but it can be difficult, right? I've been painted more times than I can count as a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer, precisely for doing this work, right? You know, and you know, if someone Googles me on the internet, right? Speaking of Google, I recognize that some of the articles you're going to come across are on platforms like Jihad Watch, right? And Jihad Watch and Spencer, they're masters at what we know as search engine optimization. And how do you get your articles on your website to rank high on the search? Those of us in the anti-Islamophobia world are horrible at knowing how to do stuff like that. We are so far behind this industry. So you know, I have had strained relationships, and you know, I have had, you know, the incident in that South Carolina restaurant is an example of a more physical confrontation. But I have to put, you know, at least prior to COVID, when I spoke a lot publicly, you know, there's always someone in the audience who really thinks I'm the worst thing ever to happen to that town or that institution for having me come to speak. And the other part of this, which is, you know, is just that, you know, if you have family, you know, you worry sometimes that they'll get targeted too. And, you know, and I'm careful about, you know, how I, you know, if I speak about my family in public or how I do that. And normally that would be more natural for me to do. But if I think they might get targeted by some of these anti-Muslim hate actors, I have to be very cautious about them. That, you know, this is me doing this. That they didn't sign up for that kind of public scrutiny, and they've always been supportive. My daughter is extremely supportive. My wife of 25 years, she unfortunately died recently, but before then she was one of my greatest advocates and promoters. But I was always a little more cautious than I normally would be had I had just been single, because I was worried about family retaliation, and I have seen some instances, including my own experience, when people came after her on a website or whatever, right? And that's the stuff that has bothered me the most. It's a form of intimidation that has the power really to work and to silence people. I've tried to resist it as best as I can, but it's, you know, I'm human too. You know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Isn't that very interesting? And it puts us very neatly, perhaps, to just refer to the French issues, the issues going on in France, where, you know, you have the freedom of speech to print cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, insult Muslims. You can call us terrorists. You can call us terrorist sympathizers. You can do all of those things under this pretext of freedom of speech. But God forbid, if Todd Green stands up and says these things are wrong, then suddenly that freedom of speech nobody's interested in. That is absolutely condemned. That's got to be silenced. And that's got to be targeted. So it just seems like this dichotomy, you know, where people are almost, you know, they have this sort of split personality when it comes to freedom of speech on the one side. And then on the other side, for example, even Muslims, we're not even allowed to be insulted or feel like we're being targeted. In fact, we're told, I've heard people say, Islamophobia is just a myth. It's nonsense. It doesn't exist. And it's like for me, it's quite hilarious how this hypocrisy exists with this whole context of freedom of speech. Like in France, for example, if you say anything against the country or you do something to the flag, it's a very serious offence. Now, where's the freedom of speech there? Clearly, you know.
No, it's there's a double standards that abound when it comes to these freedom of speech arguments, but it is a very common argument, including among what I call the more liberal Islamophobia wing in Europe and North America, to suggest that Islamophobia itself is a construct that's been put out there in order to stifle freedom of speech. It's a very, very common argument. People like Sam Harris or Ayaan Hirsi Ali and others, you know, who argue that you know you're not allowed to criticize Islam. Oftentimes in the West, you know, freedom of speech is under attack. And I argue, of course, the exact opposite. I think criticizing Islam is about the only thing you're allowed to do without impunity, right? But if you actually start having nuanced conversations about Islam and about Muslims, if you allow for a broader range of Muslim voices in terms of a public platform, then all sorts of anxiety is triggered, right? So this is not really a freedom of speech debate. Not to mention that you take the Danish cartoon controversy from 15 years ago, you take the Charlie Hebdo one, of course, right? Other incidents like a few years ago in the United States and Texas when there was a Draw the Prophet contest sponsored by Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer and others, you know, and you have these two extremists come who get killed on site when they show up. But and these all become sort of the conditions for suggesting that Muslims are just opposed to freedom of speech, when the overwhelming majority of Muslims in Denmark or in France or Britain or United States just go about living their lives on a day-to-day basis, and they don't show up to protest these cartoons, or there are lots of Muslims in France who have just put up with Charlie Hebdo, which is, in my opinion, an incredibly racist publication, right? But the overwhelming majority of French Muslims have done what? Just gone about their lives, right? And yet, when you have something like Charlie Hebdo happen, then all French Muslims, right, become implicated. Or the recent unfortunate beheading, right, that took place in France. Instead of a narrative of, well, the overwhelming majority of French Muslims are just going to go about their lives, right, in terms of when these cartoons might be shown or other kinds of critiques of Islam. Instead, they're painted as hostile to Western values. And the whole even conversation and debate about Western values is fascinating, because freedom of speech all of a sudden becomes the premier value. And when someone like me might say, well, what about freedom of religion? Because a lot of European countries have been trimming down and cutting down on freedom of religion. That somehow put it in this minority category or secondary or tertiary category. Well, that's not as much of a French value or a British value or a Norwegian value as freedom of speech, right? So there's this ranking of values that, unsurprisingly seems to benefit that which critiques, and harshly so, Islam and Muslims, but doesn't really give a lot of space for Muslims to be free and fully included participants in society. And that's, again, the kind of narrative we have to continue to challenge and deconstruct.
Yeah. One of the things, Todd, is that, I occasionally used to phone LBC Radio, and I used to have a chat, and they used to say the most sort of ridiculous, I'd say Islamophobic, I say often very ignorant things about Islam. And when I would sort of point out to them that you do realize that these things have an effect on society, they have an effect on how people feel, and feelings and how people view people will affect their actions. And I remember people were just generally very dismissive, that these are just words, people are intelligent enough to sort of, make their own decisions and what have you. And one of the things that stood out in your book, Todd, Presumed Guilty, was very early on, you give a quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he says that, words create worlds. And then he goes on to say that what begins in a word ends in a deed. Yeah. And that sort of really resonated with me, because I remember for years saying to these presenters that what you're doing by spreading this sort of misinformation is that you're going to create problems in the future where people are, it's like the snowball effect, or the last straw that breaks the camel's back. You keep saying enough negative things out there, and that every society everywhere has an element of nutcases that will react when they sort of hear these sort of things. And they were always very dismissive, but those sort of quotes really did actually stand out to me. And I think I've heard read a very interesting article by the political scientist, Professor Norman Finkelstein. And he was saying basically that, I think it was in the 60s, where there was a satire magazine or newspaper or whatever that was challenging the Algerian occupation by France. And actually they were bombed to stop them from doing that, from challenging the government sort of political ambitions in Algeria. And he was just sort of giving the parallel how nobody was out there saying, like they were saying, I'm Charlie Hebdo or whatever. They weren't siding with that magazine. They weren't sort of sympathetic to the magazine or burning, candles in the streets. But it just appears that there's this sort of hypocrisy that you can shut one side of the argument down if you don't agree with it, and almost sort of legitimize any type of action. But on the other side, it's totally unacceptable,
Yeah, and I like that you invoked that quote too earlier on from Heschel.
Yeah,
and he's in some ways referring to the Holocaust. The Holocaust didn't start with concentration camps. Ultimately, that's where it led. Started with rhetoric, right? Started with words coming from politicians who had a lot of power and had access to the prominent communication and media platforms of their time. And those words eventually conjure up this existential threat, building on, in that case, centuries of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism that ultimately lead to the horrific violence that we saw in the Holocaust. And that's how I try to respond to when people get challenged me on that. Well, just words, right? Freedom of speech. And I'm all for, of course, freedom of speech and understanding that value, but words have consequences. And words that emanate from people who have political power or who have media power, right? We have to take that very seriously. Or words create worlds, is what Heschel is saying. And what kind of words are we encountering when it comes to Muslims and Islam in the media and amongst politicians, and what worlds are they conjuring up? When Donald Trump was first running for the presidency in the United States, he started in 2015. Of course, the election cycle here is very long. It goes into 2016. We see a corresponding rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes. And this is at the same time, you have a candidate talking about Islam hates us and calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the country and flirting with Muslim registration bases, Muslim ID cards, right? The stuff that really does harken back to Nazi Germany. And at the same time, we now know we have data that corresponds to this rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes. And at least there's a correlation there that we have to take seriously. I would argue that Trump is conjuring up worlds, he's exacerbating the already hostile images that existed in terms of who Muslims are, right? And that they are this ultimate threat that has to be dealt with, right? And it's only a few more steps from there till you get really all mass violence. Not just in terms of the wars fought abroad, but within Western nations. And so, yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm complaining a lot about the media, because the journalists and media outlets have to really take this as a moral obligation. A study I've cited, can't remember if I cited and presumed guilty. I know I've cited it elsewhere. It was a study of the New York Times, again, a left-leaning publication, that found, analyzing headlines of the New York Times when Islam was mentioned and comparing it with other types of stories, is that Islam receives more negative attention in New York Times headlines than cancer and cocaine.
Wow. Now
you have to really stop and think, how many positive stories are there out there on cocaine or cancer, for that matter? And maybe cancer, if it's about, progress in cancer treatments or something, right? But you have to really push yourself to think about, how can you have better news coverage of cocaine than Islam by a left-leaning, media publication? And more importantly, for our purposes, what is the long-term impact of a prominent publication like that so consistently over such a long period of time is constantly framing Islam as hostile, as connected to terrorism and violence, and very, very few stories in terms of the proportion of stories about the complexity and the nuances of Muslims in various parts of the world, right? So these are publications that do shape our reality. We haven't talked about it, but television shows shape our reality too. Movies shape our reality. Catherine Bigelow, who directed Zero Dark 30 some years ago, which was an Oscar contender in the United States, it portrays torture in that movie as a means of sort of this pursuit of Osama bin Laden, and the movie comes under some criticism from activists and others, in terms of the U.S. use of torture and whether that is moral, whether it worked. And the response from her was, well, it's just a movie. And then my response, of course, is that it is and it isn't, right? Because the average American, just to take the United States, knows nothing about the complexities of terrorism, the political conditions that lead to it. They haven't spent any time in Iraq. They don't know anything about torture firsthand, right? Including the long history of torture that the United States has participated in, not to mention European countries. That's a whole other story. And then just kind of flippantly saying, well, it's just a movie. It's just a movie, right? People know that they're watching a movie, but know that they are their reality, their worldview is being shaped by these media outlets and by media, broadly speaking, television and movies. And we have to take that seriously. Words, stories, narratives, right? These are powerful ways of shaping what people think is real. And that's, again, another reason why combating Islamophobia is about policies, but it's also about these broader narratives and how deeply ingrained they become.
It's very interesting, actually. I think it was one of the other things. Sorry, Imran, I haven't given you guys a chance, but it was a saying by Voltaire who said that when you make people believe in absurdities, you can make them commit atrocities. And I think Finkelstein touched on that in his article, because he says that the newspaper in Germany, basically the owner of that was actually tried at The Hague because he was actually seen. I think it was Der Schumer was the newspaper in the 1930s, and he was tried in The Hague because what he was doing, the caricatures that he was making about Muslims, sorry, I beg your pardon, about Jews, were seen as instrumental to sort of increase this hostility, which then facilitated in some way the acceptance of the persecution of the Jewish people. And it's a great shame that, I think it's Voltaire. I'm sorry, I'm sort of quoting lots of things here, but I think he said, people who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And it just appears to me that if this thing's not curbed quickly, and I must say that I'm not overly optimistic, I'm hopeful, but not overly optimistic, that things can only really get worse. I mean, what's your opinion in terms of where we're going and how potentially we could sort of alleviate these issues?
It could get worse, and in fact, I've for a long time been assuming it would be getting worse, and for the most part, my assumptions have been kind of corroborated by the evidence. I think by most metrics on both sides of the Atlantic, Islamophobia has not gotten better, but worse. I mean, in any given year, you might see a little bit of an improvement or a little bit of backsliding, but if you look at the entire trend, and whether you measure that by anti-Muslim hate crimes, whether you measure that by policies, whether you measure that by, media coverage, right? Restrictions on freedom of religion in Europe, the Muslim ban here in the United States, the instrumentalization of Islamophobic narratives by politicians, by most metrics, Islamophobia has only been getting worse. And I think as long as it continues to work, right? Why is it still around? Because it works. Why did Trump, did Donald Trump win because of Islamophobia or in spite of it? I would argue in many ways because of it. I think he was, I don't know if I normally wouldn't call him an intelligent man, but he has a certain kind of intelligence in terms of understanding fear. And politicians who have that kind of intelligence and tap into it, they do know what they're doing. Trump's anti-Muslim statements over the years have not been oops moments. It's not just some sort of random unfiltered mind. He knows what he's doing. And he's doing it because he believes it works. And I think the evidence has pointed to that it did work in 2016. I think had it not been for COVID, it would be a lot more prominent in the election cycle we're seeing here right now in the United States today. But COVID has sort of sucked all the air out of the room for him, and he has not been able to instrumentalize it. But he was on the way to doing so in the year before COVID, and particularly targeting two Muslim women who are members of Congress, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and doing that again to great effect and with a pretty significant impact. And then COVID hit, and he has not really known how to sort of navigate that, and has not been able to tap into some of those fears in quite the same way. But so I don't know what the long-term COVID effect will be, and whether that will actually help us in the battle against Islamophobia. But my sense is that because of the long-standing persistence of Islamophobic narratives and how they drive certain policies and help to sustain a certain global hegemony, and where Western nations are sort of at the top of that, I think we can anticipate that there's still a lot to worry about until we see a significant shift. And depends on the country we're in, but I think in Europe you have even more significant issues in some ways because you have a legal system in many European countries that is a little bit more comfortable with government regulation of religion than in the United States, where that's a little harder. So hence these face veil bans that have been sweeping European countries. That would be hard to pull off in the United States, not because there aren't maybe a number of people here who wouldn't want to do that, but the First Amendment as it's interpreted makes it difficult to do that, but less so in Europe. So I see other structural challenges in Europe that are are quite formidable. But again, I still put my hope in grassroots movements, and I think coalitions as well. When Muslims in various cities and various countries build coalitions with other targeted groups, oftentimes based upon race or religion, there's some power that can come from that, and that's the kind of advice I usually give here in the United States. When Muslims and Jews and African Americans and others, form coalitions, and use their collective power and collective influence. Sometimes you can see the needle move on Islamophobia, and we just need more of that.
Sure.
Could I ask a little bit of a controversial question, Dr. Green? So, because obviously a lot of the work we do is interfaith dialogues and discussions and debates, and we do a lot of this work, and most of it, on the whole, tends to be very sort of good-natured. We'll have discussions, even if there's vociferous disagreements. It doesn't become personal or attacking. And what we've seen probably more over the last 4 or 5 years is it's become very much more. The focus tends to be almost Islamophobic look at Islam from some of the people we interact with, and the majority of people that we interact with, and it actually doesn't really matter about their background. So initially, we were interacting with a lot of Christians, and now it's even atheists or secularists, humanists, whoever they might be. But what they tend to do, we're noticing. Well, I'm noticing. I don't know if other brothers agree with me, but it's almost like a personal attack, either upon the Prophet, peace be upon him, or in our discussions. Even then, whoever I'm talking to, a recent terrorist attack will be raised, and often the discussion about the religion becomes almost like a secondary thing. We're trying to sort of adjust that. We're trying to have more discussions with people. I mean, you're a Christian, a white Westerner, we would say, and actually we see a lot of things in common. And even though we don't agree in terms of our worldviews, there is a lot of agreement that we can have. And I think this is what leads to sort of positive things. Now, I remember you in the book, you sort of you also mentioned that this is the Islamophobia narrative is quite strong amongst. You mentioned the southern states that you are from. Is this? Do you agree that this is now much wider and held by much other members of society? And how do we improve our interactions so that we can actually have theological disagreements and discussions in a much more amicable way?
Great point.
Yes, on the first question, I think we have data. For example, in the United States, we do have data that kind of gives us a good sense of how race and religion become the sort of predicting factors in terms of Islamophobia and levels of Islamophobia. The organization that really does great work in the United States on this is the Institute for Social and Policy Understanding, that's based in Washington, D.C. And they come out every year with a sort of a report that deals with the sort of the state of affairs with American Muslims, but particularly it includes something on Islamophobia in terms of attitudes towards Muslims. But we found, for example, that this is not just broken down regionally, but you can make some assumptions based upon the data. White evangelical Christians are the most likely to have Islamophobic views, and we have data to back that up. And white evangelicals are most dominant in the southern states, right? The faith community that has the least Islamophobic views, aside from Muslims, of course, are Jews. And then you have a range, right? And then you have to ask other questions about why that might be. But one of the things we know, and this speaks a little bit to your second question as well, and we can get more into that, is relationships can be game changers when it comes to combating Islamophobia or other forms of racial religious prejudice. If you know someone who's Muslim, the data sort of suggest more often than not you're less likely to be Islamophobic. But this works for any religious community or faith community. If you know someone who's Jewish, if you have a personal friendship with someone who's Jewish, you're less likely to be anti-Semitic. The relationships matter. Problem we have, and this is true on both sides of the Atlantic, is you have majority populations where a lot of those relationships haven't been forged very well. About 2/3, depends on the poll you look at in the United States, about 2/3 of non-Muslim Americans say that they don't know a Muslim, or they don't think they do. It's actually a tricky survey, who people think is Muslim and who is not. But still, that's a problem, right? When the relationships are not there. So interfaith work that focuses on forging relationships, I think, are very promising when it comes to combating Islamophobia. The more controversial thing about what I'm about to say has to do with, is educating the public about Islam a viable means for combating Islamophobia? This is controversial among scholars of Islamophobia. I will say this for my part. I think there's always merit to educating the public on Islam, and it doesn't have to be limited to combating Islamophobia. There are other reasons why you might want to educate the public on Islam that don't have to do simply with addressing stereotypes, right? I would, as a religious studies scholar, I'm a fan of, we should be educating the public broadly on religion, period. So there are good things that can come from it. But there are also limits to what I call the introduction to Islam approach to combating Islamophobia. And one of the limits involves to what extent is Islamophobia driven by ignorance of Islam. And I would argue, at least, that while ignorance is a factor in Islamophobia, ignorance of Islam, ignorance of Muslims, I would say that it's more of a byproduct of Islamophobia and not the cause of it. I think the cause of Islamophobia fundamentally is racism. I think racism is the real foundation of Islamophobia, and racism yields a certain kind of mindset in the broader population that then lends itself to ignorance. And so ignorance is the result, not necessarily the cause. So if you focus a lot on interfaith work in terms of, here are the 5 pillars of Islam, and this is what Muslims believe about Jesus versus Christians believe about Jesus, my advice to Muslims who do that, and my advice should be taken with a grain of salt if needed, is that could be helpful for a number of things, including just, helping mutual understanding of 2 different religious traditions that both claim this figure but have very different interpretations of Jesus.
Yeah.
But there comes a point when you can debate and discuss what Muslims believe about Jesus versus Christians until you're blue in the face, right? And there's still going to be counterterrorism policies targeting Muslims, right? That won't change. There's still going to be racism. There's still going to be discrimination in the workplace. There's still going to be law enforcement and intelligence agencies engaging in surveillance and profiling. There's still going to be a war on terror, that sort of thing. We have not found much evidence to suggest that a knowledge of Islam, at least in and of itself, is enough to change things. I would even argue that since 9/11, the organizations that try to educate the public on Islam, the resources that are there in terms of books, websites, podcasts, videos, have never been better. We've got more resources now than we had 20 years ago, hands down. There's no debate about that. But we also know from this conversation that in the same 20 years, other people have been at work manufacturing Islamophobia, manufacturing hostility towards Muslims with a lot more money and probably producing a lot more resources and with a lot more influence. And that has been a real part of the problem as well. So we have to understand that racism is what we're really dealing with here at its core. And it's not the only antidote, if you will, but one of the antidotes to racism is to trying to build bridges and relationships, which can come with all sorts of interfaith work, whether that's educational or an interfaith iftar or interfaith, soup kitchen or whatever, right? There's all sorts of ways you can build those relationships, but the relationships, according to the data, do seem to be game changers. The real important thing to keep in mind is that relationships don't materialize overnight. I always tell folks, it's great to go have a cup of coffee with a Muslim if you're a Christian, and I hope you have a good cup of coffee, but systems of oppression don't change over that one cup of coffee. That cup of coffee has to lead to something else, and hopefully it leads to a deeper friendship and deeper connections, and those connections spread to others, and then that can be translated into some kind of movement of social change, where you're collaborating together to make the changes, as opposed to just patting each other on the back because you now have a Muslim and a Christian friend, which might make you feel good inside, but feeling good inside is not really the ultimate goal. It's a nice thing, right? But it's not the ultimate goal of interfaith work.
That's interesting, because that's something that I think we've spoken about. I know Abbas speaks a lot about it. Imran speaks about it. Is the relationships and how we present ourselves as Muslims is probably one of the best ways. And it reminds me of a Khabib quote that he said. He said, "People don't read the Quran, they read you." And I guess that's it goes to what you said. It's, you can educate people. I guess you can try, but it's something deeper than that. And I think like you said, it's to an ignorant mind, a Muslim hasn't necessarily got that human attachment to it. You know, it's that other person. And like you say, I think you quite rightly link it to racism. I think that's quite right. So Imran talks about, you know, that his next door neighbor sees him as, you know, doesn't just see him as a Muslim, sees him as a human being. They interact. And I think that's addressed well in your book as well. I think that was one of the other points that I took from it, is to kind of, like you say, make relationships with these people, make them realize that Muslims aren't these, you know, just barbaric people from another land. You know, it's they live amongst you. Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point in your book.
Right. Well, and the challenge you will face when trying to address this as racism publicly is, I hear it all the time, that Muslims are not a race, which I know. Most Muslims I know that. And that's the harder point, right? They're not a race. Muslims are not a race, but Muslims are racialized, right? They are treated as a race. They're conceived of and imagined as a collective entity, as a monolithic entity. And then the actions of one sort of are now connected to all people in this collective. That's always a racialized move. And Muslims have a history of being racialized in Western societies. And not only Muslims, Jews have been racialized in Western societies. In the United States in the 19th century, even Irish Catholics were racialized, not deemed fully white. I tell that to my students today, and they scratch their heads like, wait. The Irish were not considered white, and you know, but you know, now we're starting to understand the complexity of racism, right? Which is not just about skin color alone, right? It's about who belongs, creating of categories of who is one of us and who's them, who's a native and who is an immigrant or a foreigner or whatever, and who should be included in society and receive the full privileges of being included, and then that's how whiteness gets deployed, and then Muslims are in both sides of the Atlantic today sort of deemed outside of that, and that's part of the challenge. And the other thing I'll say about the ignorance piece is Ingrid Mattson, a prominent scholar in the United States, or in Canada now, former president of the Islamic Society of North America, but I interviewed her in a book I wrote a few years ago called The Fear of Islam, about this question of, you know, educating the public about Islam. And she notes that after 9/11, like many Muslim scholars, she was just traveling around giving these Islam 101 talks. All of a sudden everyone's interested in Islam, right? They want to try to figure out Al-Qaeda and what happened on 9/11, and they think if they learn a few things about Islam, they will understand what happened on 9/11. And so she obliged, like many Muslim scholars did, and started giving these talks. But she had the same experience. It's an experience I had earlier in my career when I used to give at least variations of an Islam 101 talk, which is you get these folks in the audience who listen to the entire talk, and then they'll still ask the same questions with an Islamophobic mindset, that they'll be incredulous, as if they don't believe a thing they just heard. And so here she was, someone who's trained, it's a PhD in Islamic studies, and is trained in this stuff, and she gives these talks, and people are still sort of resistant to what they're hearing, right? And she kind of came up with a theory that this is there's a kind of cognitive block that people have in the majority population oftentimes, to where they have trouble absorbing information that's going to enable them to rethink their worldview. And psychologically, you can debate a good bit about why that might be. But she just found over and over again that doing the Islam 101 stuff and this introduction to Islam talks certainly has value to it in other ways, but it had limitations in terms of penetrating the cognitive sort of resistance that she was encountering. And how people learn is a complicated topic, right? But people learn. I've learned this as a teacher, as a professor. It's not just what I say in the classroom in a great lecture. I can give the greatest lecture in the world, and my students might not absorb any of it, right? But if I take the time to mentor them and build relationships with my students, it positions them really to hear and learn and engage with me in a very different sort of way. And I think this is true of Muslims who want to teach about Islam. If you're doing it in the abstract or without relationships being forged, there is going to be limitations to how many minds you might change, or you might still encounter a lot of resistance. But relationships really can be transformative. They're just, when I tell this to an audience, what I have to say is, and by the way, I'm here as a speaker, but I can't give you those relationships. I'm about to leave and go back home. You've got to spend the time and build those relationships, and authentic relationships with real mutuality and reciprocity. They don't take just a few days or a few weeks to establish. In many cases, they take years. for the deep relationships to really take hold. And the communities I have found traveling around both Europe and the United States, where I see the most successful efforts in combating Islamophobia through interfaith work, involves interfaith efforts where those relationships have been forged over years. Yeah. They didn't just pop up, 6 months ago, right? They've been around a long time. So you're in it for the long haul when you're doing this work.
And is it go on, Abbas, you go.
Sorry, Jordan. No, I was just going to quickly say it's very interesting because, and again, I do apologize for quoting too many things, but I think it was, I can't remember who said this, but he said, I think that you can't, if somebody hasn't been reasoned into a position, you can't reason them out of it, basically. So, you describe where if people have this sort of, underlying hatred and racism, I agree with you that just discussing religion or explaining what your religion means, it's very difficult to chisel away those predispositions that person might already have in place. But I do agree with you that those relationships, going out for coffee or having a discussion or a chat. I remember hearing on the radio where one of the presenters was saying that some of his friends were saying to him, "Oh, we've got Muslims moving in next door." And, he said, "Well, so what?" He said, "Oh, but they're Muslim, And then apparently a week later or whatever, they were around their house eating samosas and having tea. And then they sort of phoned him again and said, "Oh, they're lovely people," And the presenter was just sort of explaining that, he was just sort of saying that, well, what do you expect? They're just like everybody else, But it does surprise me that often people who are generally educated, to a reasonable level, perhaps postgraduate or whatever, and they still have these predispositions, which I do find rather astonishing, really, in today's day and age, where, as you say, it's very easy, really, to find out about Muslims. But these are educated people. They have a level of sophistication where you'd expect them to easily be able to, reason their way out of these things. But I think some of these fundamental feelings that people have, and I think, unfortunately, we do live in a world now where I think feelings tend to trump everything else, whether it's the data or anything else. But it's fascinating, actually, what you were saying, Todd. Sorry, Jordan, before you come in, I just wanted to sort of apologize to Todd that we've been going for over an hour and a half. I just wanted to sort of make sure, are you okay? We're not sort of, taking up too much of your time here. Is that?
No, I've got I have another 20 minutes or so.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Todd.
Sure.
Yeah, I think what because I think off the back of what Abbas said, I actually can understand why people view Muslims a certain way, because if you grow up in this country or America perhaps, and all you see, a white person maybe growing up in their family, and all they hear from the media is terrorism, grooming gangs, whatever it is over here, and I too came from that mindset. So before I came into Islam, I had issues with Islam. I wasn't out there protesting or joining any organizations, but I just thought there's something not right. And it's probably all of the things that I'd heard, just, subconsciously you end up thinking, well, there's something not quite right there. So I guess from you, I mean, did you also, because presumably you haven't always been this reasonable, perhaps, I don't know, maybe going along the lines of, you talked about relationships. Was there a relationship with a particular Muslim that made you or turned you onto this journey? Because, a lot of people will be asking, I think, why are you spending so much time on this? Why does this necessarily make a difference to you?
The way I answer that question involves the lack of relationships I had at a certain point when I should have, and I needed such relationships. And so my prior career, before I went back to do more graduate work and become a professor, my initial career as a much younger man, was as a minister. I was a Presbyterian minister. And I was a Presbyterian minister when 9/11 happened. That's what I was doing back then. And the thing is, I lived in a city in Texas at the time, and had spent some work. This is late 90s, early 2000s. Spent some work, engaging in interfaith dialogue. It was mostly Christians and Jews in the city that were doing this stuff. But I had been building relationships across religious boundaries to some extent there. And yet, 9/11 happened. And of course, I have a congregation. In fact, there's a city full of people, Christians mostly, who are now desperate to learn all this stuff about Islam and learn more about Muslims, and wanting to even hear from Muslims, as if, that there's this new novelty now. There, can we get a real live Muslim in our church to talk? And had this been a number of other religious communities, I already had the relationships, but I did not have them with Muslims in the community. And nor did I have a good working knowledge of Islam. It was really, really bare bones knowledge that I had. Seminary education for clergy back then, and to some degree still now, but certainly back then, it really didn't prepare you for knowledge of religious traditions outside of Christianity, not in any significant way. So you kind of had to learn that stuff on your own. And so here it is, September the 12th, 2001, and I feel like I was, theologically speaking, caught with my pants down, right? I was ill prepared, and I had a lot of anxious people that I was tending to as a minister who assumed that because I had some sort of education in religion, I was now this sort of living, breathing expert on Middle Eastern politics and Islam, and and I wasn't. And that in itself wouldn't have been so bad had at least I could have immediately reached out to someone who came from the Muslim community, and I didn't have those relationships. And I do remember, Jordan, back then thinking, I will never let this happen again. I will never be caught this ill prepared again, precisely at a time when anxieties are running high. And you guys probably remember just the immediate aftermath, at least, of 9/11, again, in Britain as well. But, it was a very tense period. And we now know from retrospect in the United States, it was a huge spike in hate crimes targeting Muslims, and lots of unrest and lots of uncertainty. And my job was try to bring calm and order to all of that by my knowledge of religion and my Islam, and my presumably knowing someone who's Muslim, and I had neither. And in the case of Muslims, and that was that I promised not to do that again. And I'm no longer a minister. I've given up that career for a long time. But the idea of I won't let this happen again, is sort of one of the things that drove me to do what I do today. When I did become a scholar and I came back came out of my PhD work to do my scholarship, and eventually to start to become more of an activist. I'm in some ways trying to make amends for what I was lacking back then, though I don't think I was unusual. I think most Christian clergy in the United States in 2001, if not in 2020, are still kind of woefully lacking when it comes to knowledge about Islam, and oftentimes even relationships with Muslims.
Thank you.
I think, sorry, Abbas, I think you're about to say something. I want to try and interrupt you. So I think you sort of, it's been really profound actually listening to you. And I think one of the things that I've completely agree with you is about this idea of real relationships. And I think because we as a group started off actually in going to local churches for meals, and then just discussions, and then afterwards having informal sit downs and chats, and making actually friendships. And we did this for a number of years before we started doing any sort of public work. And we came from that sort of background. And I think I'm blessed to have really good examples of really good, caring Christians in my life who I can, we can speak all the time, and we can have this. And I think what that does, it does engender this idea that we're the same. We're human beings. We have a different worldviews maybe, but actually we like food, we like family, we like security, we like to go and watch a movie here. And we are the same essentially underneath all of this. And I think that the wisest words probably that you could give anyone is actually, if you want people to view you differently, have a relationship with them. And I think that's really, really profound. And I like the fact that, because you're absolutely right, we get into this idea that if we can refute something, or if we can, maybe just throw some information out there, that will be enough. But actually, we need that human-to-human contact. And I think that you've inspired me actually to sort of maybe up my game in that regard. And you bring something to mind, actually. I remember in the road where I live, there's maybe 4 houses down as an Orthodox Jewish family. And I remember when we first moved into the area, my children were very young, we often would sort of quickly go by each other without even making eye contact. There was this sort of inherent distrust of each other maybe. And I think one day what I did was I sort of realised, I've been here for a number of years. We've never even spoken. So I just pulled my car over and I went up to this gentleman who was sort of, with his hat and the whole, and I just said to him, my name's Imran. I'm your neighbour. I live a couple of doors down the road. Just thought I'd say hi. I said, if you ever need any help, I'm your neighbour. Just feel free to come and ask. And that just opened a massive change in, we were saying hello. He was waving to my children. We were asking how it was going. We had a few discussions on the, because we were discussing with Christians in their churches. We had a discussion about the Torah, and we just became normal friends. We would look out for each other, and you're absolutely right. The whole thing changed. And I think that's really, if anyone wants to take anything away from this, I think the way the grassroots changes would happen is when people start to make contact with each other and learn about each other, then we can actually stick up for each other.
Absolutely. Again, it took time for you to build that relationship, right? And you actually had to take the initiative at a certain point to, get out of your car and,
sure.
And then want to invest in it long term, but then you see the fruits of that all these years later, and it's I'm a big believer in the building relationships. It doesn't mean that you won't have significant differences across religious traditions. I mean, those don't disappear, but it means your ability to talk about those in a nuanced way and in a respectful way is heightened considerably, as opposed to sitting Christians, Jews, Muslims in a room who don't know each other and then said, let's talk about Palestine and Israel, right? Good luck, right? I've never seen that work without the relationships being forged first. That conversation doesn't get easy once the relationships are forged, but there's a trust that develops that enables you to tackle the more difficult, pressing issues. This other question about relationships that comes to mind, and this is just a personal thing. I wasn't planning to talk about this, but I mentioned earlier that my wife died recently. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in May of 2019.
Gosh.
And we spent the better part of a year in hospitals. We live about 70 miles from the Mayo Clinic, so she had a lot of her treatment there. But she was hospitalized in the course of a year, probably about 18 times. I'd lost count at a certain point. It was, pancreatic cancer, for anyone watching, it's brutal. The treatment is still lags behind other cancer treatments that have progressed a lot, over the years. But it's a very difficult cancer to manage, and we spent, again, a lot of time in hospitals, including times that normally would be holidays. So over the Thanksgiving is a holiday in November in the United States, and my wife was in the hospital on Thanksgiving Day last year. She was in the hospital on Christmas Day last year. 2 separate hospitalizations, actually. The people who reached out to us most consistently, there's plenty of people who reached out, but, Muslims, Muslims near and far, including not even in the United States alone, Muslims in Britain. I have, just a far cry from 19 years ago, when my big problem was 9/11 had happened and the people were demanding this, understandably, that their minister helps them understand Islam and helps connect them with Muslims. And I don't have any of that for them, right? And then 19 years later, when I'm in the worst part of my life as an adult, right, wrestling with, helping care for my wife, who, I kind of recognized throughout the year she was going to die, right? And it was Muslims who were there providing condolences, who were offering prayers. When we were in the hospital on Thanksgiving Day, it was a local Muslim family in Rochester, Minnesota, who brought us food. So we didn't have a Thanksgiving meal at home. My daughter and I ate food from a Muslim family, and then it happened again on Christmas Day. On Christmas Day, what a great interfaith gesture, and a gesture of just compassion, that our Christmas meal as Christians, or people with a Christian background, came from Muslims on that day, right? In a hospital setting, when they knew that we were far from home or not at home, right? And visitors to the hospital, I started to recognize, and I have to be careful how I say this, but you get to a certain point in your life when you're trying to find out, who are my people? Who are my people? And it was very clear to me, compared to 19 years ago, that my people, the people I connect with, the people who I know are there for me, include a lot of Muslims, even though I'm not myself a Muslim, right? But I was treated as I belonged to this larger family, and it was extraordinary, and it's something I'll never forget, right? But the power of relationships, and then how those relationships come to bear when I'm not needing support for writing a book on Islamophobia or publicly challenging Donald Trump or whatever. I'm kind of in this private sphere of my life trying to manage things with this dreadful disease that my wife is battling, and it's Muslims who are there on the front lines in terms of care, and that's the power of relationships and interfaith work in the long run, and a big difference in 19 years of my life and when I didn't know any Muslims at all. So now going back to Jordan's earlier question, I have had a lot of significant relationships with Muslims, and it's not just when I'm doing my activism work. It's been in some very private moments, very intimate moments as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Todd. I think that's incredibly powerful, and I think it just shows just how much our actions actually can make such a huge impact on one another and on the community as a whole, and that we all have a responsibility really to make sure that our interactions are wholesome, and that we actually, not just out of kindness and out of empathy and humility and humanity, but also with the concern of, I hope, leaving a better world for our kids, where we don't leave them in a society that is ridden with hatred, division, because it's not a nice place to be. It's not a peaceful place to be, regardless of what side of the spectrum you're on. That sort of animosity that runs through the veins of society is a very corrosive, a very damaging, way of living. And so I hope that people can take away from the stream, really. I hope that people perhaps who are undecided or whether, they should reach out to one another, whatever, that they realize that it is important and that it really does make a very big difference, I think,
Agreed. Thank you. Yeah.
I just really wanted to echo and just say, my condolences for the passing of your wife. And you're absolutely right. Pancreatic cancer is a horrific condition to go through, and normally 3 months is what people tend to get through in terms of surviving once they've had their diagnosis. So, I'm glad that you had the time that you had with your wife after that diagnosis, and we wish you all the best in sort of as a family in getting on and with your life. Although these sort of chasms are never sort of filled. So I feel really privileged to have had you with us. I feel very honoured that you came onto the show. I learned great. Although we're speaking for the first time directly here, you've been influencing me probably for the last 5 or 6 years, and in a positive way, and actually really changed my outlook on how I do things and how I interact. Thank you very much for that, and continue your work. And I think you've given a lot of us sort of an insight into how we can try and improve the way we not only do things, but actually try to make a change, because you've given us insight into, really reminded us of the things that we should already know, that actually the key is not just information or just facts, it's actually humanity and relationships. So I really appreciate you coming on today.
I think one last thing I want to just say before Jordan perhaps says something is that this is basically Todd's book. We've got a link in the description as well. You can go and get the book. It's a fascinating read. It really is. I'm actually slightly dyslexic and I struggle to get through books. This is probably one of the only books in recent times that I've struggled to put down. It was that good, really.
Oh, good.
And in fact, you might see the Post-its here. I sort of started putting Post-its as I went through the book again, Todd, to ask you questions. And then I found so many interesting points on almost every page. I gave up putting Post-its anymore. I said it was going to be too much. I just end up filling the whole book with Post-its. I think it really is that good. And I think it's a powerful read. And Imran sort of alluded on the fact that, you've influenced his decisions and affected him in many ways. And I think from Imran, actually, who recommended me the book, it really did change a lot of my thinking as well. And I think then we had discussions with Jordan, and I think we encouraged Jordan to read the book. And so that's how it sort of dominoed, it sort of went down, and we all sort of, I think, have benefited greatly. And we're very, very touched. We were really excited when you accepted the offer to come and talk to us. We've been actually talking about the stream for, I suppose for days now. and you haven't let us down. It's been wonderful. But I'll leave it to Jordan to perhaps close. And from me, a big thank you. And we hope that we can get you on again. Maybe discuss some of your other work, your first book that you wrote. And we would be certainly privileged to have you back on again. But Jordan, I'll let you sort of finish up, and then, you know.
Yeah, no, I echo what the brothers have said. You know, obviously regarding your wife, you know, really sorry to hear about what you went through, and yeah, I really appreciate you also sharing what you shared, because it was extremely powerful. End of the stream. Yeah, I was kind of blown away really by what you said, and again, what you mentioned about Muslims is something that I commonly hear is, you know, people are always amazed how supportive Muslims are in tough times, and I think that's really, really good to hear. I think what I'd actually like to clarify by saying, because I think there will probably be people watching this stream, you know, wondering what we actually talking about, and I wanted to just look at the back of your book says, and it's quite categorically says, all of us should condemn terrorism. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear, that you know, by no means is this stream about not condemning it, but it's obviously talk. And you also write about friendship, not fear, on the top in big letters, and you've gone through, you know, various things like that. And yeah, personally, I'd like to thank you, because it certainly shifted my mind. Imran will tell you, we had a very heated discussion. I think, look, we mentioned about a famous attack. And Imran began to talk about the nuance of it, and I said, why on earth do you even need to mention that? And it wasn't really clear to me, and this was even as a Muslim. But I think Imran gave up with me and said, Jordan, just read this book.
I think he said, shut up, just read this book.
I think he did. I think it was very aggressive, and I did shut up, and I did read the book. And yeah, and I think, look, obviously you mentioned at the beginning that your message is to, you know, a certain type of people, but, you know, it had effect on me as a Muslim. It shifted my mind. I think there are probably Muslims out there that feel that they probably have to answer all these questions from people, and I think it's very powerful for Muslims and non-Muslims watching. So yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, and yeah, thanks a lot.
No, thanks for having me, and yeah, it's and I know it's a provocative topic, to be sure, but I'm glad that we had such a nuanced conversation about it. I hope the people watching were able to understand some of these nuances too, right? Yeah, I should also say that about every other year I'm in Britain. I teach a study abroad course called Islam in Europe in London. We spend probably usually better part of the week and a half there, and so. If anyone's watching and ever wants to meet up, I think I'm supposed to be there. Because of COVID, we're going to skip a year, but hopefully in January of 2022, I will be back to visit. And anyone who wants to meet a bunch of American students who are brand new to the topic of Islam and help them understand the dynamics of Islam in Britain and what challenges British Muslims face, I hope you'll look me up and send me an email sometime.
Well, Todd, you can contact us anytime. And in fact, even during your courses that you have there at the moment, if you ever feel that you'd like us to join your students in a stream and just discuss things candidly, openly, we're available at any time. We would be happy to take part.
I may take you up on that. So thanks for offering. Yeah.
That's very good. Thank you very much, Todd. And we just want to basically thank you and hope to see you again very soon.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to the next time.
Thank you, Todd.
Great. Take care.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone who watched.